Hey there everyone, Ramesh here, back again with another crash course. In this crash course, we'll take a look into how to use optional class to avoid null checks and null pointer exceptions. Well, null pointer exception is one of the exception that frequently occur in day-to-day project work, right? And null pointer exception is like a close friend to the Java programmer, because whenever we write a program or whenever we work on Java project, then this null pointer exception will frequently occurs. All right, so in this course what we're going to do is we're going to see how we can use an optional class to avoid the null checks as well as null pointer exceptions. Well, why optional class? Well, before optional class we were writing a lot of null checks, right? For example, consider we have an employee class. It contains all these fields, right? And if you can see this code snippet over here we have a get employee method. So consider this get employee method is retrieving the employee object from the database, and consider we have a email which is null in a database. Okay, so here if we call a get email method on employee object, then this returns null because employee does not contain email id. And if we call to lowercase method on null reference, then this definitely will give the null pointer exception, isn't it? And in order to avoid this kind of null pointer exceptions, we are adding a null checks, right? For example, employee not equal to null, and within that employee dot get id not equal to null, and again employee dot get email id not equal to null. So here we have just added a null check for these two fields. What if we have a requirement to add a null check for other fields, right? So basically we need to write a lot of null checks over here. So adding this kind of null checks is not a good practice, isn't it? So we have to provide some solution for this. That is where the optional class were introduced. So optional class basically help us to avoid writing null checks, and it will also avoid to produce the null pointer exception. Now let's see what is optional class. Well, Java 8 has introduced a new optional utility class in java.util package. This class can help in avoiding null checks and null pointer exceptions. Well, if you can see this diagram over here, optional class, it acts as a single value container that either contains a value or does not. Okay, we'll see an example how optional acts as a container object. Now let's go ahead and let's head over to the Chrome browser over here, and here just type optional class java doc, and just go ahead and click on this docs.oracle.com. okay, so this will navigate to the optional class java doc. Alright, now let's go and let's explore some of the frequently used optional class method. And before that, you can see here optional is a final class. It means we cannot extend optional class, isn't it? And optional class is basically a utility class which is present in java.util package. Alright, and here you can see optional utility class provides some of the static methods: empty, of, op, null, NullAble. So these three methods we can use to create a optional class object. And here are some of the instance methods. Okay, get, IfPresent, isPresent, orElse, orElseGet, orElseThrow. Well, in example we'll see some of the frequently used optional utility class methods. Now let's go ahead and let's head over to the IntelliJ IDEA, and let's see the usage of frequently used optional utility class methods. Alright, we'll see how to create an optional class object, and how to get a value from the optional class object, and how to check whether optional contains a value or not, and how to get a default value, how to throw the exception. Okay, we'll see a lot of things using optional utility class. Now let me jump into IntelliJ IDEA. So this is the Java Lambda expressions project I have created in one of the previous video. So let's use this project for this optional class demo. Now here I am going to create a package. Let's call it as optional, and within an optional package I am going to create a class. Let's call it as optional demo. Alright, now within a class let's have a main method, and here we're going to first see how we can create an optional object. So basically there are several ways to create an optional object. For example, we can use op method, we can use empty method, and also we can use op NullAble method. So these are the three static methods that we can use to create a optional object. So let's go and let's see how to use all of these three methods to create an optional object. So first we will see how to create an empty optional object. So here let's type optional and make sure that you choose optional from java.util package and then call its static method, that is empty method. Now let's go and let's assign the value of this empty method in a local variable. So go ahead and introduce a local variable over here and just give the variable name as empty optional. Hit enter and we're gonna put one sysout and just print empty optional. Okay, so before running this program, let's deep dive into empty method and let's see its internal implementation. So let me jump into empty method over here and let me go to this empty, and you can see here this empty method returns basically a empty object of this optional class. Okay, great. Now let me go back. Now let's go ahead and let's run the program and let's see what this empty method prints. Well, let me run the program now and there we go. Empty method returns optional.empty string, right? And you might be wondering where this optional.empty string present. Okay, let me show you. So just go ahead and jump into empty method and just search for optional.empty and it is present in toString method. So this is how we create an empty object using optional class. Now let's see how to create an optional object using op and opNullable methods. So here just have optional class and then call its static method, that is op, and then pass the value. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare one variable, let's say email equal to ramesh@gmail.com, and then I'm going to pass this email to the op method. Alright, and now let's store this, store the value of this op method in a local variable. So go ahead and just introduce local variable and let's call it as email optional, and let's go and let's put the sysout and print email optional. Well, before running the program, let's understand the usage of this op method. Well, let me jump into this op method and you can see op method internally provides a null check here. You can see required not null method, right? So just remember op method internally provides a null check for this given value, and if you can go to required non-null method, you can see it throws null pointer exception. If a given value is null, then it will throw the null pointer exception, otherwise it will return the value, right? So it means that whenever you are sure that this email is not null, then you can go ahead and use op method to create an instance of optional class object. Okay, so whenever you are sure that this email, any object contains a value, then you can go ahead and use op method to create an instance of optional class. Okay, otherwise it will give the null pointer exception. For example, now this email a variable contains a value, so it won't give you null pointer exception. For example, let me run the program and you can see here it print the optional class object. Now if I assign a null to this email reference variable, then this will give a null pointer exception. You can see here, okay, this line, because optional method internally provides a null check for this given value by using objects.require non-null method. Well, I hope you understood the usage of op method. So whenever you are sure that the object that you are passing to this op method is not null, then you can go ahead and use op method to create an instance of optional class. Alright, now let's go ahead and let's see how to create an optional class object using opNullable method. Well, let's call the optional class and make sure that you choose optional class from java.util package and then pass string and let's call it as string optional equal to optional, and then call its static method, that is opNullable. And if you can see here, opNullable method returns optional class object, right? So go ahead and call opNull method and then pass email. Alright, perfect. And then put this out over here and then print string optional. Okay, so now let's understand the usage of opNullable method. So let's deep dive into this method first. And here you can see, if the given value is null, then this method returns a empty object of optional class. It won't provide the null check for this value. What it does, simply whenever this value is null, then it will return the empty object of optional class. It means that this opNullable method won't throw the null pointer exception, even though if you pass the object which is null. Okay, because you can see clearly, if the value is null, then this simply returns the empty object of optional class. This, right? Let me go back. And if if the object contains a value, then this method returns the object of this optional class, and it will simply pass the value to the optional class constructor. Whenever you are not sure that whether the object contains a value or not, then you can go ahead and use opNullable method, because this opNullable method won't throw the null pointer exception. Okay, it will handle the null pointer exception by returning a empty object of the optional class. Okay, so yeah, that is the usage of opNullable method. Now let's see the usage of opNullable method in an action. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass null value to this email object, and let me run the program now, and you can able to see the null pointer exception. So this is the null pointer exception from this line of code. So let me comment out these lines of code for time being, and now let me again run the program, and you can see here this returns optional.empty, because we are passing the null value to this email object. That's why it is giving optional.empty string, right? So it is not throwing null pointer exception. In fact, it is just returning the empty object of optional class. Now let's pass the value to this email object. Let's say ramesh@gmail.com. Now let's run the program and let's see how it works. And you can see here, this opNullable method returns the value of this object, right? So just remember, whenever you are not sure that whether this object contains null or not, then you can go ahead and use this opNullable method, so that it will internally handle the null pointer exception, and it simply return the empty object of optional class, right? If the value is null for this object, then it will simply return the empty object of optional class, or else it will return the optional class it contains a value. Alright, so these are the three static methods that we can use to create an instance of optional class. Well, if you can closely observe this optional class object, it acts as a single value container because it contains a value. For instance, let me run the program, and here you can see optional is basically a single value container. It contains a value. Okay, so now you might be wondering how I can retrieve this value from the optional class object. Optional class provides a get method, so that we can use to get the value from the optional object. So let me show you how we can do that. So you can see here we have already a optional class object. Let me call here a get method on this optional class object, and now let me run the program, and you can able to see we have retrieved the value from this optional class object. Okay, just remember, whenever you want to retrieve a value from the optional class object, then you can go ahead and use get method. Now let's see the internal implementation of this get method. So let me jump into this get method, and here you can see if the value is null, then this get method simply throws no such element exception, and this is the exception message, that is no value present. It means that whenever we retrieve empty or null value from the optional class, then it will definitely throw this no such element exception. For example, let me show you this demo. So let me go back to optional demo class, and here let me assign a null instead of the actual value. Okay, now let me save it and let me run the program, and there we go. This get method simply throws no such element exception because this opNullable method returns a optional empty, and then we are trying to get that empty, we are trying to get a value from that optional empty object. That's why it is throwing no such element exception, isn't it? So just we have seen its internal implementation, right? If you again jump into get method, you can see the value is null. That's why it is throwing this exception, and we have assigned a null value to this reference variable. Okay, I hope you understood the internal implementation of get method. Okay, so whenever you want to retrieve a value from the optional class object, then you can go ahead and use get method. Well, in real-time project, we don't call this get method directly. We need to first check whether the optional class contains a value or not, right? So in order to do that, we can go ahead and use IfPresent method. For instance, let me write the code snippet over here and let me show you. So here I am going to call a string optional object. It has a method called IfPresent. So IfPresent method returns a boolean value here. Alright, so whenever this optional class object contains a value, then this IfPresent method returns true, or else it returns false, right? So go ahead and call this IfPresent method over here. Alright, and then I am going to print this optional object value within this if condition. Okay, or else simply let me put the sys out and let me say no value present. Okay, let me run the program and let me show you how it works. And there we go, no value present. Alright, this is how we use IfPresent method to check whether the optional class object contains a value or not, and then based on that we call the get method. Now instead of passing null, if I pass the value to this email object, then this will print this statement. So let me here pass the email ID, that is ramesh@gmail.com. Now if I run the program, this should print ramesh@gmail.com. Alright, this is the usage of IfPresent and get method. Now let's take a look into how to get a default value from the optional class object. Well, sometime we may have a requirement like if the value is not present in optional class object, then we have to get a default value from the optional class object. Well, basically optional class provides orElse method which we can use to retrieve a default value. For instance, here I am going to demonstrate the usage of orElse method. Well, let me comment out this code first. Now we have optional class object. It has a value email, right? Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say string optional dot orElse method, and you can see orElse method takes parameter of type string and it returns a string, right? So just go ahead and call this orElse method and then pass here some default value, let's say default gmail.com. Alright, and let's take the value of this method in a local variable. So let's introduce a local variable over here and let's call it as default optional. Perfect. Now let's put the sys out and just print default optional. Now let's jump into this orElse method and let's understand how this method works. Well, let me deep dive into this method, and if you can see here, if the optional contains a value which is not null, then it simply returns that value, otherwise it returns the default value. Okay, for example, here other meaning the default value, right? For instance, you can see we have passed the default value. Alright, it means that if this string optional object contains a value, then this method simply returns that value, otherwise it returns the default value. Alright, it's straightforward, right? If you look at its internal implementation, this method simply returns a value if it is not null, otherwise it returns the default value. Alright, pretty simple. Now let's go ahead and let's run the program and let's see how this works. There we go, ramesh@gmail.com, because this string optional object contains the value. That's why it returns the value from the string optional object. If I mention this object as a null over here, then this should return the default value. So let me run the program, and you can able to see it will print a default @gmail.com. Alright, so this is how the orElse method works. Well, there is a one more method, that is orElseGet method, which works similar to orElse method. So let me demonstrate the usage of orElseGet method over here. So let me call optional, that is string optional over here, and then call its method, that is orElseGet method. And if you can notice here the difference between orElse and orElseGet method over here. orElse method takes a parameter of type string, but orElseGet method takes a parameter of type supplier interface. So this is basically a functional interface, so we have to use a lambda expression to implement supplier functional interface. So let's go ahead and let's call orElseGet method over here, and just pass the lambda expression, and just pass value as default @gmail.com. Okay, so if you look at here, orElse and orElseGet method, so both work similar way, and only the difference you can see the parameter type. So orElse method takes string, orElseGet method takes a supplier interface, and we have used lambda expression to implement supplier interface. Now let me introduce the local variable here, and let me call it as default optional 2, and let me put the sys out, and let me print default optional 2 here. Alright, so let me just comment out this code, and let's go ahead and let's run the program, and let's see how this works. And this also prints the default @gmail.com, because we have assigned a null value to this email object, right? So this should be a Gmail. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to assign the value for this email object. Now what will happen, basically this orElseGet method will return the actual value from the optional object. It won't return the default value. Alright, now let me run the program, and let me show you. And there we go, ramesh@gmail.com. Okay, now let's take a look into the internal implementation of orElseGet method. Well, let me jump into this method, and you can see here, if optional class object contains a value, then this method should return that value. Otherwise it returns whatever the value that we pass to the supplier interface or the lambda expression. Okay, it's pretty simple, and this works similar to orElse method. Only the difference we can see the parameter type. Alright, so this is how basically we use orElseGet method to return the default value. Well, there is a one more method, that is orElseThrow method. Well, sometime we may have a requirement like whenever a value is not present in optional class object, then we have to throw the exception, right? In that case we can use orElseThrow method. For example, let me demonstrate this. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call string optional dot orElseThrow, and you can see there are two orElseThrow method. We're going to use this one because we're going to explicitly throw the exception, right? So just go ahead and call orElseThrow method, and it takes supplier interface, so we have to use lambda expression to implement this supplier functional interface. So let's go ahead and let's call this method. Alright, and here what we're going to do is we're going to use a lambda expression, and we're going to use illegal argument exception over here. Okay, and we can pass the message something like email is not exist, something like this. Now let's introduce a local variable over here, and let's give name something like optional object, something like this. Hit enter. Alright, and now let me put the sys out, and let me print the optional object. Now if you can see this string optional class object, it contains ramesh@gmail.com value. Hence this orElseThrow method simply returns this value. Okay, it don't throw this exception. Okay, so let me run the program, and let me show you. And there we go, ramesh@gmail.com, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a null value to this object, and now this orElse method would be able to throw this exception. Now let me run the program and let me show you the same, and there we go. Illegal argument exception, email is not exist. Okay, so whenever you have a requirement like if the optional object contains a null value, then you can go ahead and throw the exception by using orElse throw method. Alright, so this is how basically in real-time project also we use orElse throw method a lot to throw the exception if the optional class object don't contain a value. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and let's take a look into the internal implementation of orElse throw method. So let me jump into this method, and here you can able to see if the optional class object contains a value, then this method simply returns that value. Otherwise it simply throw the exception. Okay, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Alright, I hope you understood the usage of orElse throw method. Alright, so whenever this optional object contains a null value, then this method should throw this exception. Okay, great. Now let's take a look into one more important method, that is IfPresent method. IfPresent method. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an optional class object of type string, and then let me call it as gender. Alright, and just create an optional object by using op method, and here I'm going to pass a male. Okay, and let me similarly create one more optional object over here, and let me call it as gender or empty optional. Okay, and let me create a empty optional object. So in order to do that, call the empty method. Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and let's see the usage of IfPresent method. Here I'm going to call gender optional object and then call IfPresent method. If you look at the IfPresent method parameter over here, it takes a consumer as a functional interface, right? So we're going to use a lambda expression to implement this consumer functional interface. So let me call this IfPresent method over here, and let's use the lambda expression, and let's put the sys out over here and just print something like value is present. Alright, perfect. Now let's go ahead and let's run the program and let's see how this IfPresent method works. So let me run the program, and here is the exception. So this exception is because of this lines of code, so let me comment it out. Now let me run the program and let's see the output, and there we go, value is present. This string is printed to the console, right? It means that if this object, that is optional object, contains any value, then this IfPresent method will simply execute this code. Here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call IfPresent method on this empty optional object. So here I'm going to call IfPresent method, and simply I'm going to pass the lambda expression, and I'm going to put the sys out, and let's say no value present, something like this. Now let me run the program and let me show you the output, and there we go, value is present. It means that this IfPresent method simply printed value is present because this gender optional object contains a value male, right? That's why this IfPresent method just printed this value is present string, and this second IfPresent does not printed this no value present string because it is called on empty optional object, right? Because empty optional object does not contain anything, it is simply a empty, right? If you look at the internal implementation of IfPresent method, you would be able to understand easily. So let me jump into IfPresent method over here. You can able to see if the optional class object contains a value, then only it will execute this code, otherwise it don't execute anything. Okay, and this method simply returns a void over here. I hope you understood the usage of IfPresent method. Well, optional class contains a filter method. Now let's take a look into how we can use a filter method of optional class. Well, here first of all what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the code without using optional, and then bit later we'll see how we can use a optional filter method. So here I'm going to create a string object, let's say result equal to ABC. Perfect. So without using optional, we need to use a if condition for the null check, right? So here let's say result not equal to null and result dot contains ABC, and then what we're going to do is we're going to print the result. Okay, let's consider this is the code. Okay, so this code simply check the null check this object, and then it will also check this condition. If both the condition are true, then only it will print this result. Okay, now let's see how we can use the optional class filter method to convert this null check. Okay, so here what we're going to do is we're going to convert this object into optional first. So let's use optional over here and pass string as a type, and let's call it as optional string equal to optional, and then let's use op method and then pass a result. Okay, now we have created optional object and we have passed ABC to this optional object. Now the optional object contains ABC value. Okay, now let's see how we can use a filter method to add this condition. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use optional string here, and then I'm going to call its filter method. Well, if you can see the parameter of this filter method, the filter method takes predicate functional interface as a method parameter, right? So we have to use a lambda expression to implement this predicate functional interface. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this filter method, and then let's say result, and this is a lambda expression, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to say result dot contains ABC. Okay, now we have added a filter for this optional object. Well, what we have done basically, we have called this filter method on optional class object and we have added this condition. Okay, next we need to print the result using sysout, right? So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to call one more method over here, that is IfPresent. Okay, if the optional class object contains any value, then only this method will execute. So let me call IfPresent over here, and let me use the lambda expression to implement the consumer functional interface. So look at here, IfPresent method takes consumer functional interface, right? So let me put the sysout and let me simply print the result. Okay, so this is how basically we use a filter method on optional class object to add the condition on the optional object value. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the program, and yeah, so let's see how this works. And you can able to see ABC. It means that the given condition, the condition that we have added using filter method is returned true. That's why we can able to print this result using this IfPresent method. Okay, so this is how we can use the filter method to apply some condition on the value of optional class object. Okay, it's pretty simple. Well, optional class provides one more very useful method, that is map method. Okay, so let's see the usage of map method. Well, map method in a optional provides a way to transform value in a optional from one type to another type. For example, let's consider this example itself. So here we just change the value. So this value now contains the spaces. Okay, now let's convert this value into without space. All right, so here after filter method I'm going to call a map method here. Okay, and you can see map method takes a function as a method argument, and function is basically a functional interface, so we can use a lambda expression or method reference to implement this functional interface. So let me simply use the method reference over here, string and then method reference, and here I am going to simply trim the spaces. Okay, I am going to call trim method over here. Well, it's pretty simple. So we just need to remove the spaces and we need to convert this string into another string by using map method. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's run the program and let's see how this map method works. And there we go. Alright, it simply prints a ABC, right? It means that we can use a map method to transform a value in optional from one type to another type. Alright, so this is how we can use a filter and map method to add some condition or convert from one value to another value on an optional class object itself. Okay, so these are the few very important optional class methods or APIs that we frequently use in our day-to-day projects, right? So I hope you understood the usage of all these optional class methods, because these methods we frequently use in our day-to-day project work. So just take a look into all these methods and have some hands-on experience. Alright guys, I hope you understood how to use the APIs or methods of optional utility class. Alright, great. I will see you in a next video.